Well, hi everyone, welcome. I guess by now you know that we do these regular webinar sessions at Beeswax that we started through the pandemic, covering all different kinds of topics, and some product related, some general interest topics. And I think it's become a bit of a tradition, if we can have that in 2 years, that I do a summer session where I get to interview Ari and hear his perspectives. And so I guess with the pandemic, we've been running sort of internally lots of different icebreakers and things with the team. And one question we had recently was, what's the best gig you've ever seen? Tina Turner was my answer. I'll tell anyone who wants to know about that gig later. But that we went from Tina Turner to Cher to If I Could Turn Back Time. And so I'm here today with Ari, and the idea was really to cover kind of trends in programmatic. If we could turn back time and start the programmatic advertising industry again, what could the industry, or should the industry, have done differently? And so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Cadi Jones. I am the commercial director of our business in Europe, or outside of the States. And Ari, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, I'm Ari Paparo, the co-founder and former CEO of Beeswax, now the head of partnerships for Freewheel, and happy to be here. Sort of, I'm not really, but I'll do my best to keep a smile going. I can't do a Cher impression. I do know. So I put out some misinformation on Twitter because I said that Turn Back Time was the first song to ever use auto-tune as a trivia, and it was not. It was actually a different Cher song. Believe was the first song to ever use auto-tune.
Will you give us a rendition?
Well, I can't auto-tune myself, but it's that heavy one, you believe in, that. So we've got that anyway. And someone else on Twitter recommended I embarrassed myself in various ways in line with the If You Could Turn Back Time video, and I will not participate in any of that foolishness.
I'm quite pleased about that, if that's okay to say.
Yeah, right. The stuff I'm doing is I'm wearing a Beeswax branded shirt. That's my contribution to team spirit today.
There we go. And so before we kick off, I did want to draw attention. There's a Q&A box here in the chat. So please do feel free to add your any questions here, and we will make sure we have time for questions that you've asked as we go through the session today. And so I thought it would be nice to start with a question around premium. And so when I started work at Yahoo, they just bought Right Media, and that in those days, going back to sort of 2008, we didn't release any of the premium Yahoo inventory for trading programmatically. You couldn't get the Yahoo finance page or the Yahoo homepage through those channels. And I think most publishers were quite slow to release their inventory into programmatic, certainly the premium inventory. We started everything with open marketplace, and then the demand side kind of had all of the decisioning power. If we were starting over again with programmatic, what could have been done differently from the start to make those sort of premium publishers, or make publishers more confident kind of releasing their premium inventory for programmatic transactions? And I'm going to click on to a Cher lyric. If you could turn back time, Ari, what would you do differently for premium publishers and for premium advertisers, or advertisers who wanted to access premium supply?
It's a really hard question because the history lesson, which I think you alluded to, is that programmatic was a remnant solution. Let's not forget that. When it was first invented at Right Media, it was a pure remnant solution. And then as Google and other companies developed and invested in this area and built marketplaces and exchanges and et cetera, it still was a remnant solution, very direct response oriented, and most major publishers were hesitant to get involved. I wrote an article about the subject that I think was one of the better things I've written. You can Google it. It was in Ad Age, and it was called like "Don't Look Now, but Classic Disruption is Coming to Advertising." And what it was arguing was that the remnant solution had certain benefits to the entire advertising world around efficiency and transparency in a way that was eventually going to claim premium and everything else. And I think I was largely vindicated. I think I was largely right about that. So the question is there some way we could have gotten premium there faster? Because there are, to enjoy the benefits of the RTV channel. And what I think we've seen is that one of the ways that premium ad slots become available in this way is with either private marketplaces or programmatic guaranteed. And both the private marketplaces always existed, but were pretty wonky until Deal ID really got going in the 2012-ish timeframe. And Deal ID was always kind of this hack on top of RTB, and it had problems. It still has problems with it. So number one is we could have had Deal ID from the start. That could have been a part of the way we built this stuff. Most of the original RTB pipes were all, basically impression by impression with no concept of a deal or a broader spectrum of buying. And so that would be the simplest thing. But Deal ID is somewhat, I mentioned earlier, it has some problems. Like one of the problems with Deal ID is that it's transparent to a large number of buyers. So it sort of leaks information. The second problem with Deal ID is that the economics are usually developed offline. Even in this day, very, very few Deal IDs are negotiated programmatically. They're negotiated by phone calls and tracked by spreadsheets, and then they're transacted through RTB. And all of that infrastructure is frankly still immature today. And now, so what we have now over the last, call it 3 years that's developed is programmatic guaranteed, which is effectively bringing the old way of doing things, the ad server way of doing things, where you have a tag that always shows the same advertiser in certain forms, to RTB. I would be foolish to think that we could have developed programmatic guaranteed 10 years ago, because I think that various companies tried and didn't end up succeeding. Like there were startups that just did this sort of thing, there was buyads.com, which had a different corporate name, got bought by Rubicon. I think Rubicon actually bought most of these companies at various times. And there were these companies that would let advertisers, buy ads directly out of the ad server in a programmatic way. And they didn't succeed.
That was kind of what Open Direct was aiming to do, but that never kind of took off, right?
Right. And there was also pre-programmatic, there were these initiatives under the IAB and the 4As for things called e-business, where you would have XML that would communicate between the buy and the sell side to create ad slots. And so it's a pretty messy situation. And programmatic, what happened was basically we're investing in all these ways for the buy side and the sell side to bring ad slots to each other. And then programmatic came, and programmatic, frankly, was so much more beneficial to the buy side than any of those other ways of doing things, because they actually let the buy side use their data, control frequency in a way that those other situations never would. The programmatic became the only story in town for 5 or 6 years. And then we finally addressed the premium use case in programmatic with Deal ID and programmatic guaranteed, which are sort of like, a little bit of awkward overlays on top of RTB. So I guess that was a very long history lesson, but not necessarily anything very specific about how it could have been better.
No, but I like it effectively that, thinking about this sooner, coming to it with more of these sort of solutions, and actually, you're so right that so much of this is still sort of negotiated offline. Yeah. I'm trying. I don't know. How quickly do you think that will change?
Well, I think that one of the challenges is on the buy side is that buyers, use, and actually on both sides, frankly, is the proliferation of vendors. Both buyers and sellers use too many vendors, and I think they all know that, but they feel like they're trapped. And if they, on the sell side, if you remove an SSP from your header, you end up losing some money. And we all know publishers will do almost anything for money. But having more publisher SSPs means you have more complexity. It's harder to execute deal IDs, and it gets just complicated. And on the buy side, there's been a reduction in the number of DSPs the average brand uses. I think that's been our experience at Beeswax, but also what we've seen in the trade press. But you still have, I would estimate the average brand has somewhere between 3 and 5 DSPs, maybe more even on average. And as a result, tracking things like, annual guarantees to a given publisher on a worldwide basis is something that no individual tech platform can do. It ends up being something an agency does or a spreadsheet. And so you have I think the tech sort of gets in the way a little bit in this environment from having a more holistic view of how your money is being spent and how you can kind of track it better.
I feel like we may have picked up on our first recurring theme here that may come up throughout, that things that you're doing offline in a spreadsheet, not necessarily the best.
Not necessarily. You kind of it's like that. It's a freeze frame. How did we get to this situation? Right? It's like, I'm using a spreadsheet to track this. Why? Okay, well, I was going to use only one ad server, but then my DSP started tracking things better. But then my DSP doesn't do business in Latin America, so I need a second DSP. And then that brand manager wanted to use that DSP in Europe for some reason, and now I have 5 DSPs, and I have to use a spreadsheet. So,
okay, not a lot of love for Excel.
Yeah.
So I started with talking about I started the questioning on premium because I think some of these things are sort of things that I think we really could have done better. But when we're talking about premium, I think kind of the creme de la creme, the most premium at the moment is very much sort of the happening in the CTV space. Programmatic very clearly started out with display. We added mobile, we added video, different channels and, formats have kind of all been bolted on to a certain extent at later points. Could there have been an approach that would have made maybe it much smoother to adopt these additional channels as we've gone along? It makes sense, there weren't smartphones, right, in 2008, but how might we have thought about it differently if we were starting over?
Every channel, each channel as they've been added has had its own differences, right? Going from, say, web to in-app is kind of an easy one because you have a different identity solution. You have the IDFAs or the mobile IDs, and you don't have cookies. So that has different challenges, and conversions are meant differently. So there's really you have to take each one on its own. If you look at the challenges of CTV currently, I would say there's 2 big ones. One is identity, which is a challenge everywhere, but it has specific CTV problems. And the other one is what I would broadly call context. As far as identity goes, the CTV market in terms of the devices consumers use to watch content is very fragmented. I would argue more so than sort of desktop banner ads. The reason being that, if you think about your own personal experience, you might have an ad-supported account, like a Peacock account. Let's go with Peacock, and you might access a desktop phone, living room TV, home, bedroom TV, and
tablet when you're traveling.
Yeah, and when you're traveling, and so these don't just have different IDs; they have different ID spaces. They're totally different the way they track things, and so from a seller's perspective, the ID problem is significant. But from the buyer's perspective, using an arm's length DSP to access Peacock, but then also advertise on CBS All Access or some Viacom properties or wherever, it's a real challenge to manage frequency, to apply third-party data, et cetera. And so that's kind of your first order problem. And there's lots of work being done on that, but it's a hard problem, especially because In general, the closer you get to the telecom world, the more tight privacy regulations get. Just to generalize, not speaking as an employee of Comcast, but I would just say in general, telecoms are pretty tight with their privacy policies.
And rightly so.
And rightly so, exactly. Whereas, ad tech companies will do whatever the hell they want, right? As long as the commissioner in Ireland doesn't send them a nice, nasty note. I'm being facetious. I'm just kidding. So that's the first problem. And I'm not sure what we could do to solve that problem. I mean, obviously, getting people's logins through Trade Desk UID2 is something that's interesting. There is an investment that Comcast has made in a company called Blockgraph. There are a lot of interesting things going on with identity. Context is, I think, a little more interesting. So I think as digital first people, we have in our mindset this idea that context equals domains or URLs. And if you have the URL that a piece of content is being shown on, that an ad is being shown on, that you can derive the context. In the CTV world, as well as in the app world, to be honest, the context is not URL dependent. It's about what show you're on, what ad slot you're in within a pod, what episode you might be in, what the episode is about. And largely that information is not available to buyers right now. And it's largely not a technical problem because a lot of these fields exist in OpenRTB. There's various content fields that exist that are almost always blank and are not being provided. But for a buyer, you would think if you were a naive person, let's say you're not an ad tech, I'm talking to some random business person and I say, hey, how you could advertise on Peacock, isn't that cool? Using the Trade Desk. And they would say, what would they say? They would say, that sounds great. I want to advertise on, Brooklyn Nine-Nine episodes that don't have any violence in them, right? That would be a kind of a typical sort of naive thing that an advertiser might want. And that's really hard to do through programmatic. You could do it if you call up your NBC salesperson, no problem. But if you want to do it the way I said, using a DSP, that's going to be really hard. It may not be possible. And this goes also for short form content. Basically, if you have an embedded video clip on a web browser on let's say a recipe site, you really don't have a lot of context. You have the URL, it's a recipe, that's about it. You don't really know what your ad is in front of or what's going on. So I think that's a big miss and something that is subject not just to technology, but also to channel conflict issues, because one of the reasons that media companies are limiting the amount of metadata going out is for channel conflict, but also there's tech issues involved.
So, and does this come back to the sort of premiumness of it and the sort of programmatic's failings and sort of reputation as well?
I don't know if it's, I think we're over the point where the reputation of programmatic is the issue. I think that was an issue for a while, but I think everyone acknowledges that the major agency holding companies and the premium brands have certain desires to use certain, I'll call them certain pipes to execute. I think it's now coming down a little bit more to channel conflict, because as the consumers move from the old way of consuming content to the new ways of consuming content, there's risk to the revenue flows to media companies, because the old way of selling ads against the old way of selling content is very lucrative, and you need to very carefully transition to the new way, or you can miss something. Interesting.
So it's almost a sort of people and process issue rather than a tech one.
And pricing as well, right?
Yeah, all the complicated P's.
Yes. Exactly.
So I want to come back to something you touched on before around identity and kind of more broadly on data. Obviously, the big story for most of the last year or so was the forthcoming cookie apocalypse.
Yeah.
And
the apocalypse, it's kind of like COVID; it keeps coming back.
Right, but I think there was a sort of general big shock to the system with the announcement about just how much of what we rely on depends on third-party cookies. Everyone's like, well, I'm a brand advertiser. I might not care about third-party cookies. It's like, well, you want a frequency cap, right? And so kind of there's so much involved there. I guess if we were starting over, hang on, what's my next oh, there we go. If we could reach the stars on identity, is there a different way you would approach this from the beginning? Is it is there a sort of tech problem, a solution? Is it more about education on the value exchange? Like, are cookies actually the best way of doing this? And should we have fought for them harder? Like,
yes, this is a tough one. I mean, I think
right?
I'll also kind of address this more as a history lesson than necessarily a suggestion, which is, I believe that cookies, third-party cookies, are the reason why programmatic took off, because it was the first time you can get any sort of behavioral data targeting at scale. There was when I was at DoubleClick, at that time there was a startup, that well-known startup called Tacoma, that was very popular. They were the innovators in behavioral targeting. I think they may have even come up with that phrase. And they were telling advertisers, like, you could reach left-handed golf swingers and stuff like that. And then my CEO, David Rosenblatt, at the time, would put up this slide. It was the Tacoma slide, because we saw them as a competitor at DoubleClick. It was a Tacoma case study slide, and it showed like their great success. And then there was a footnote, and he had a big like arrow pointing the footnote, and it said N equals 32. And he'd be like, their case study only reached 32 people. And so that was behavioral targeting before programmatic. And so if programmatic existed without cookies, imagine a world where cookies didn't exist and then programmatic came up, everyone would basically say, why would I take this effectively more expensive way to show my ads? What's wrong with using DFA or Atlas as my ad server and like getting good reports? Like, why do I want to buy impression by impression? And the answer would be, there's no reason. The two reasons to buy impression by impression were the ability to apply data and the ability to frequency cap, more or less. There's a budgetary reason as well. You can turn on things on and off faster, but that's not nearly as important. And so, and I guess also shifting between publishers. I mean, there's the whole flexibility of it being a spot market, but like really it was behavioral. So option one is you don't have cookies from the start, in which case I think the whole industry develops differently. You don't end up with much programmatic. You end up with more of that e-business kind of solutions, the automated buying and selling of ad slots, as opposed to spot by spot. Then maybe the second question,
like more controlled by what the publisher can offer and the supply side than the demand side picking and choosing the impressions.
Yeah, exactly. You'd have bundles, maybe in million impression buckets or something like that. So then the second question is, could you have replaced cookies with something else earlier? I don't think you'd have any luck getting publishers to do a UID type email hashing mechanism unless they had to. Right. I mean, so I don't think that would have flown 10 years ago. No one would have done that. And then you're saying, well, okay, well, could we have done something to make cookies better? Maybe that would probably be, if we had, there was the whole fight over do not track where the IAB and Microsoft and other people ended up, walking away from the table. Maybe if we hadn't walked away from the table and we'd accepted do not track 10 years ago, even on bad terms, cookies would have been less of a target than they are now. Another thing we could have done would be, if we had anticipated privacy from the start, we could have made more of the ad calls from the page server side. So you can imagine, like right in the early days of programmatic, if you were to say Rubicon, you took your ad tag, you gave it to the publisher then ran it on the page and ran an auction, which effectively gives Rubicon the cookie ID, the IP address, the fingerprinting information, whatever it wants. I'm not picking on Rubicon, they're just a good example. And that effectively is your privacy loophole right there. So instead, we could have tried to invest in something closer to like Google's exchange bidding or server-side requests that had more privacy controls built into them from the start and only gave identity in some limited way. Once again, if we had done that, it probably wouldn't have been as good. You wouldn't have made as much money, and the people who didn't respect privacy would have put the tag on the page, got the cookies, and made more money. So I'm not sure we could have done it differently. Is the bottom line here.
Well, that's something, I guess. All the chat of the last year means it was worthwhile. We had some good years of it before
Yeah.
before we had to spend our time saying cookiepocalypse without laughing too much. Um,
Yeah.
but so from identity to maybe sort of thinking a bit more about sort of first party data. I
Mhm.
think there are lots of brands, lots of publishers who have these great sort of direct relationships with consumers, with end users. It seems that there was still so much reliance on third party data for shaping campaigns. I mean, if there was a chance to begin again, do you think would brands and publishers sort of spend more time investing in their first party data? Would that have been a good use of time?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's interesting comparison to think we don't talk about social very much because we're ad tech people, and the ad tech world is always like, except for social, which is giant. But if you have a list of email addresses of consumers, you could just upload them to Facebook and target them, and no one's asking 3 questions about it. It just works, right? They just hash the emails, match them, and you get your ads, right? And compare that to doing the same thing on a major publisher site, like anyone, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Like I'm not even sure you can do it. Like you get a DMP involved, maybe you need a clean room, maybe you need 2 clean rooms. I don't know. And so that's kind of amazing how much less liquid we allow for first party data usage. And I think it's a little bit it's a couple things. One is that we're as an industry have built everything on third party data. So in theory, I have a pixel on my page. I can target that user on the New York Times, and it's easy. I'm putting that in quotes. It's easy compared to collecting someone's email address and matching on a hash basis. But it's much less reliable and accurate. And it's totally vulnerable to third-party cookies going away. So we invested in a solution that seemed a lot easier, but actually had far less longevity. Whereas, Facebook has the benefit of having everyone's email address. Obviously, they require registration, and so they've been able to build a machine around first-party data usage. So in effect, we're catching up to that by enabling by having publishers put more and more paywalls or partial paywalls, et cetera, in order to collect those email addresses. I think there's also this weird regulatory thing where back in the 90s, when this industry first started, there was like this paranoia about PII. Everyone's heard the phrase PII.
Yeah.
You can't collect PII, right? And then DoubleClick ended up getting sued by 49 attorneys generals about it because they, bought Abacus, which was a PII company. And then like after they got sued and fast forward to like 2004-ish, everyone's like, it's probably fine. Don't worry about it. Right. And now everyone has PII of all kinds. Like it's called first party data now instead of PII. And instead of DMP.
For me, I much prefer someone had my cookie ID than someone had my email address. I don't know how, it's amazing to me that doesn't get more attention.
Well, yeah, I think that I agree. I mean, I think that a lot of the privacy conversations are based around the easiest thing to pick on. Like if you can load a page and see a bunch of pixels load, you suddenly realize you see everyone is tracking you. Whereas if if it's more private or happens behind the scenes, no one sees it.
You're pinning us on ghostery.
Yeah, right, exactly. So anyway, that's kind of my long answer to your question. I feel like first party data is really important and really valuable, and there's a little bit of a catch up because the default way most web publishers work was to not require it, and now they're trying to kind of work backwards into requiring it.
Well, this has been fascinating so far. I'm going to remind the audience that we have to please use the Q&A functionality in the Zoom toolbar. If you'd like to put similarly share themed questions to Ari. I have a quick fire round though, if you're ready for this. So just to kind of get us ready for the questions from the audience, which may be more hopefully more brutal than some of mine. So first up, what programmatic idea should never have seen the light of day?
VPaid. it's not really programmatic, but VPaid is an abomination. It should never have been established as a standard. It's a giant security risk that lets the buyer take advantage of the publisher's video player. It should never have been allowed. It's garbage.
That's why you built Vast?
I built Vast, and so like there was this whole committee. We worked really hard on Vast, and right before it was being released, the Yahoo people were sort of like, "Hey, we just need to have a little interactivity. So here's this other standard with VPaid," and everyone's like, "Yeah, it looks okay." And then so it was the giant mistake. It should never have been allowed.
Did not know that's how it came about. Okay.
Yeah.
Is there something or anything really where we did as an industry kind of take the right approach from the beginning?
The right approach from the beginning, that's a tough one because we make so many mistakes. I think ads.txt was fantastic. Ads.txt is fantastic. The IAB leadership, the tech group deserves a lot of credit for it. Why it was fantastic was because it was easy to implement. It solved one very specific problem. And it gets a lot of criticism because it doesn't solve the problem of like publishers lying. But like it solves the problem of publishers saying what they're doing. And you can see through the adoption has been incredibly high. And I think anecdotally, the rate of spoofing has declined precipitously.
That's cool. I'm glad there's something on that list.
Yeah.
And then, so what are you most excited about for the next 10 years of programmatic, like ahead, the 10 years ahead?
Well, I think
will Excel be completely gone?
No.
From ad ops teams?
Excel is like duct tape for the digital world. Like it's never gone. You can never get rid of it. What am I excited about? Well, I think that I think that you will see some convergence across screens in terms of the way you buy and sell ads, more so that buyers will hopefully start getting a better sense of how their media budget works across different channels. In a way, I think getting rid of cookies is good in this way because it will, if you think about there's a lowest common denominator, and like cookies on the 60% of web browsers who have them have a much higher ability to target and track. So bringing that closer to the lowest common denominator is actually good because that same lowest common denominator would work across audio ads, CTV, et cetera, et cetera. So I think like we're better off having less tools in the web-based digital world as a way of making people essentially think more broadly.
It kind of forces us to innovate more and adopt new things
more across screen, right? Exactly. Because while cookies work, people are just lazy and they're like, well, I still have view through attribution, so why should I use anything else?
Fair. And so we talked a lot about industry. I'm going to final quick fire question. What are you personally most proud of delivering through the last 10 years?
Well, my accomplishments are so broad, it's hard to narrow it down, right?
Is it your humility?
No, I mean, I think that from a tech perspective, I think the Vast is a great, is not a great standard, but it did its job. We have enormous liquidity in the video market because of Vast, and that was what it was supposed to accomplish. It's been messier than I thought it would be, but it worked out pretty well. I think personally, though, Beeswax got up to 100 employees before we were acquired by Comcast. I feel great about helping so many young people with their careers and getting people into ad tech or moving the ball forward on a lot of really interesting things. I've made a lot of great friends through that, including you, Katie. Can we sing "I Got You, Babe"? That's what I share. Like if we're doing karaoke duet.
This is going to live on in perpetuity. All of our videos are stored on our website, on our YouTube channel. There's no way I'm going to sing on this. But next time we're in person together, we can absolutely karaoke it. We have a ton of questions from a very engaged audience, I think, here. So I'm going to remind Ari, you have the right to dodge a question or two if you need to from
not a problem.
We're going to get in trouble. So header bidding should have been released before Google got such a strong hold on supply. Discuss.
Okay, that's interesting. I think, let's be real. The header bidding is a hack to get around Google. If Google didn't exist, if Google didn't have DFP and AdX together, there would be no reason to have header bidding. right? So let's start there. But once header bidding came out, people found uses for it. Even now that Google has exchange bidding, you have the same downstream demand source getting requests from both the header and an exchange, so that doesn't help. Should header have been developed before Google? I don't know if anyone really would have thought of it. I mean, header is a very non-intuitive concept. It was only created out of necessity. I think that perhaps the industry could have come out against dynamic allocation stronger and earlier on a legal and policy point of view. Basically Google's acquisition of DoubleClick was not objected to by the government as it relates to DFP at all. And the various lawsuits from Rubicon and others against Google came out much later. I think it was 5-6 years later when things started really percolating, whereas it could have been maybe affected from a policy point of view much earlier.
Thank you. I think that's pretty balanced view on that one. So Ari, what single mistake would you go back and correct in programmatic if you could only pick one?
Might be cookie syncing.
It's no one's favorite.
I don't know. Then cookie syncing wouldn't work because, I mean, as I said earlier, programmatic never would have taken off if the buy side didn't have the data. But cookie syncing is really nasty, and it looks bad from a privacy perspective, and it's messy. I had this idea when I was at AppNexus, which is maybe the buy side should pay for QPS. So like, what if DSPs had to pay, a half a cent CPM for every 1,000 bid requests? You would have, because the fact the buy side doesn't pay is sort of a tragedy of the commons problem, where like everyone is listening to everything and all the data is moving around effectively with no solid economics behind it. And so maybe that would have been an interesting little tax to put on the transfer of data, and would have made a lot of the decisions around things like header bidding a lot more logical, because header bidding with the proliferation of QPS really hurt everybody and really didn't help anybody. So that could have been one way to do it.
Interesting. Yeah, you needed a lot of the SSPs to deliver more traffic shaping tools.
Right. Or maybe the opposite. The buyers could have charged the sellers, or something. I have to think it through, but there's some way. The fact that QPS is free between buyers and sellers is a real problem.
Noted. That sounds like a good, big, meaty problem to fix. Question here: why would server side be more privacy preserving?
Right. So what I was thinking was that when you're client side, a lot of data leaks automatically, and there's no way to stop it. Like IP address being one example. If your tag is on a page that's loaded by a browser, your tag will get the IP address, and there's nothing anyone can do about that. Whereas if you're going server side, let's say you go from the web page to the ad server, and then the ad server to the exchange, the ad server can change that HTTP request in any way it wants. It can remove the IP address, it could truncate the IP address, it can not pass the cookie, it can do whatever it wants. So you could have a layer of business logic protecting privacy or enhancing data as you wish if it's server side.
Thank you. Cool. I have another one, a theory for you to sort of rule on here. But the whole cookie issue should be solved by the hardware provider. You buy a Mac, and during the setup, you have three options. One, no ads at all, but you need to use donation platforms like Patreon to support the sites you consume content from. Two, non-tracked ads, which mean higher amount of ads. Or three, personalized ads, perhaps using cookies. What do you think?
Okay. Yeah. Good in theory. So in practice, let's hardware providers, kind of a red herring in that theory. Let's talk about first party. So Apple currently believes that they have the right to track you in their ad network because it all happens on device, and effectively they're acting like the first party. But there actually can be 3 or 4 different entities who claim to be a first party in a given transaction. Consider the Chrome browser on your desktop, which is a Mac, operating through your DSP or operating through a gateway, that's three different parties who can claim to be the first party to control your identity. In addition to the publisher, you're on the New York Times website, right? So that's four different parties who can claim to be a first party in a single transaction. And so it gets kind of complicated to start.
The telco as well.
The telco, yeah. So saying like it's up to the hardware provider, I don't think is really great. It may work in mobile, in-app, because that's more like an environment, but it doesn't work on desktop at all. And it's questionable what would happen on my TV. I have an smart LG TV where I watch Apple TV and then I turn on YouTube TV on that. That's a pretty complex situation. I would suggest, here's my alternative. I'll come back at you. I would suggest that we should have governmental regulation that says that that outlines exactly what anyone who produces a web browser must allow the consumer to choose between. And it could be opt-in, opt-out, or something in between, and that would be the level at which I think you could do
it. Thank you. Interesting things to consider. I have we have a curveball now around our the acquisition and our new Freewheel family. The person asking the question was hoping that Beeswax would go long on democratizing programmatic. Do you think you can still do that under the Freewheel umbrella?
Democratizing is such a loaded word. I mean, we're still offering what we offer, right? So the Beeswax Bidder as a Service still available, growing quite well, thanks to Cadi and her efforts. And to the extent that is democratizing, then we're still fully pro-democracy here in our colony of Freewheel, I guess you put it, to use some bad ways. So that's that. I think over time, our roadmap is going to, and we've said this publicly, is going to focus more on video and premium, because we think we have some really unique abilities to bring the market forward as a part of Freewheel, as a part of Comcast.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're straight back to data with the next question. I should have grouped these a bit more. Is there a role for third-party data in programmatic, or is it the snake oil of the 21st century?
Not a loaded question. People in ad tech are so dramatic. Like, I don't think MarTech questions. Like, if you go to an email marketing thing,
no one's had the death of in any of this.
The death of the apocalypse. Is it? I think that. I think there's been a lot written about this, that the reliability of generic third-party data is very low, and you've heard people who try out gender splits and don't get good results. I think that using select third-party data in very targeted ways around things like post-viewer offline conversions from reputable firms who have real panels, that certainly has its place. But I think even in the cookie era, the reliance on a lot of third-party data was probably not a really good ROI. And as we move to not having cookies and more of these data sets are going to be targeted on households, you really have to wonder what it means to be, an auto intender of a household when there might be one person who's really researching the purchase and a bunch of other people who are going to be sitting in the backseat.
Interesting. And I think somewhat related to that, we've had a question come in through the chat function too, asking, is there a way to audit first-party data? So I think the publisher data sent in the bid request at the moment. What if, as a publisher, I fudged audience mix info to sort of fit the premium mold and solicit higher bids? Can we audit for that stuff?
It's a very good question. I've thought about that too. I believe the IAB is working on this. So the IAB has part of its REARC task force has been addressing first-party standards. I think there's really, I call it three approaches. One is self-regulatory, where the IAB is going to put out some standards and people are going to have to certify for it. The other is to use a vendor. So there are vendors like Permutive and Lotame who are helping publishers organize their first-party data and sell it. And you have to assume that the vendor is going to be a little more easily auditable, I guess you would say, or easily trustable than like each individual publisher doing it themselves. And then the third option would be some sort of, governmental or quasi-governmental auditing capability. That sounds like something they'd probably work on in Europe. The US is kind of averse to that sort of thing. So that's why we have our healthcare system the way it is. That would be my prediction for how it would work out. I think right now people are just really happy to have any data coming from the publisher. So mostly we're in that phase where people are just trying to get the ads to run and to get experiments with first-party data to make them, operate smoothly.
Brilliant. Thank you for joining me today, for answering my not so share themed questions. Thanks to our audience for asking such brilliant questions, and for sticking with us. And we'll see you again for the next webinar. I think we have a panel coming up in another couple of weeks' time. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Thank you, Ari.
I got you, babe.
See you. Bye.